Hello and welcome to today's event as part of the Court International Festival of Literature. This is the second attempt. We had a few technical problems, but we're back online, and if there is any other issues, just bear with us. It'll be worked out in a second. Just a brief word of, my name is Dwyer, and I'm delighted to be here today to have a chat with Billy O Callaghan about his book Life Sentences. Just to say a few words about the structure or the form of today's event. So I'm just going to say a few words about Billy and Life Sentences. Then Billy is going to come in himself and he'll give us a reading and an overview of life sentences. Then we're going to have a chat about some of the themes that have been in the book, and then there'll be a Q&A. So after about 45 minutes, there'll be the Q&A where you'll have a chance to ask Billy questions about the book. Just to introduce myself and maybe explain why I'm sitting here. So my name is Dwyer. As I said, I'm a historian, and there's a somewhat of a relevancy to why a historian would have a chat with Billy about life sentences, because I suppose the backdrop to the book is some of the most important events in Irish history over the last 150, 170 years, events like the famine, the First World War, and then the general experience maybe of women in the mid-20th century in Ireland. But to say history is only a small part of this book, and when I read it I was really blown away by several aspects of the book, but particularly the way it deals with two. I think I found the book, or for me it was a very universal book, in that if you had no understanding of some of those events that I've talked about, the famine or the First World War, and you'd never understood, you'd never heard of them, I think you would relate to Life Sentences, because it has two themes in particular: the idea of trauma that passes from one generation to another, and then the importance of family. And I think no matter where you are in the world or what your experiences are, this would relate to you. Secondly, I think the book is written in this incredible style, and before today's event, myself and Billy had a chat yesterday just about how it would work and the structure of the event. And when we were having that chat, I picked up the phone to ring Billy, but it was this odd experience in that I felt that I knew Billy having read Life Sentences, and I think that's down to the way the book is written. Even though it's not written from Billy's point of view, it's three separate people and kind of I suppose an internal monologue. There's an intimacy and an intensity to the book that you almost feel like you've had this chat with Billy, and I think as well the fact that it's partly inspired, I suppose, by experiences of people in his family gives you that connection. But that really makes this book a really powerful experience to read. And when I was thinking about it in a way, the words of my English teacher, when I was doing the Leaving Cert, kind of came back to me, and he used to always say there was two types of books, and one book was a book maybe that you might extract information from, and you gently turn the page and you're very careful about it. And the second type of book is the book that you devour, and when you're finished with it, it's got like dog ends and there might be a bit of a cup of tea spilt over it because you were so engrossed in the book that you brought it everywhere with you into the kitchen to make the cup of tea, and it inevitably becomes, I suppose, part of you as you read that book. And for me, Life Sentences was very much the second type of book, the book that you get engrossed in, that you feel the characters in the book are, you feel so close to them, to their experiences. And then I think as well, as I mentioned earlier, these universal traits of family, of trauma, that we all can relate to on some level. We may not have the experiences that these people in Life Sentences go through, for example, things like the famine, the First World War, extreme violence, but we can relate to them. I suppose the attempt to better themselves is something that people often relate to, and even today it's so relevant, given that Irish society is still trying to come to terms with the past, with things like mother and baby homes. I think Life Sentences really brings that into contrast and gives a very useful insight into how people deal, not just that, but in general, how we engage, the complexities of life. I think what I'm going to do there is, I think I'm going to ask Billy to come in maybe at this point, because obviously he's the man with the information on this. And I'm going to ask Billy, first of all, to give us a bit of an overview of Life Sentences. Then Billy is going to give us a reading, and then we'll have a bit of a chat about the book. So over to you, Billy.
Okay, thanks, Finn. I'd love if you were my book reviewer from now on, because that's lovely to hear. Okay, yeah, Life Sentences is it's a story of three generations of Cork family. Um, it spans a period of time from the aftermath of the famine, the early 1850s, through to the 1980s, the early 1980s, and it's told in three sections, three different first-person narratives, and it's told in a non-linear fashion. So the first section is narrated by Ger, who would be based on my great grandfather. Then the second part, this is in 1920. It's based around the time when his sister has just died. His sister Mamie, she's just died, and so the first part takes place at that time. Then the second part goes back to 1911, and it's his mother's narrative, Nancy, and she's she's elderly and she's looking back over her life, so you get a much broader scope in that section, and then the third section comes forward to 1982, which is Nellie's story, and Nellie is Ger's daughter, his youngest daughter, and my grandmother, based on my grandmother, and so she's dying at that point in the story, in her mid-60s, and she's looking back. Her life is kind of coming into focus. So I'm going to read a section, a small part from towards the end of the first section, which is Ger's part, and this takes place just after his sister Mamie has been buried. So I'll just get into it. Knowing that I won't easily sleep, I remain a while in the solitude of the yard, until the cold drives me back inside. Not wanting to disturb the others, I take up the armchair in the living room, reach for the poker, and stir awake the fire's embers. An orange glow rises up from the feathers of ash, and I add a clod of turf and a few scraps of kindling. Everything is changing. Until a few days ago, I had a sister, struggling and in poor health, but there to visit, to sit with and talk to, she taking my hand whenever she could, and mostly ignoring my questions about how she was feeling, to ask instead if I was happy, if I'd gotten what I wanted from my life, and if what I had been given was enough, as if I'd had any kind of choice in the way things worked out, as if any of us did. Asking too if the war was at all as bad as she felt certain it must have been, the damage that showed itself on some men, that sort of cracked, glass-eyed madness, was with everyone who'd been through the fighting, even those who had found ways of keeping it concealed. And asking in the quietest possible way, shyly or with embarrassment, if I ever got lonesome, needing something from me, I sensed, some few words that might begin to explain her own state. In such moments, she couldn't bring herself to look at me, and seemed always on the verge of tears, and all I could do was squeeze her cold hands and try to make less of such talk, mainly because I had no good words to give back in response. And now, watching the fire and thinking about all that I'd been given and all I've missed out on, I realised that my life is defined every bit as much by absences as by acts. As much as I might think I've suffered, I'm finding out that there's always something more that can be taken. A few days ago I had a sister, and now I don't. Tonight I have a mother, but a week from now she too will be gone from my life, dealing with Spillane, far away from where I can offer any kind of protection. She hasn't lived a day of her adult life for herself, And now that she's found a new need for sacrifice, my attempts to change her mind or Spillane's will be a wasted effort. So he'll go, taking his and Mamie's children with him, and my mother will go too, putting up with whatever it takes to see them reared. Her family might have come up crooked, but she is determined to keep it nourished and to give it every possible chance to thrive. I close my eyes and try to concentrate on savouring the wash of the fire's heat across my face. In France, I recall our commanding officer telling us that indulging too much in memories was precisely the medicine for getting a man killed. And what applied then still hasn't shifted, a fact as true of the most ordinary day as of the bloodiest battle. What's needed to get through is a focused mind. So now, though I let the thoughts of Mamie come, I am careful to keep them at a step's remove. That's cold of me, because if ever there could be a time and place to open up my heart, then it's here and now. Alone as I am, by the fire with a high wall of night before me, and with my family, everyone in the world who has my love, safely tucked up and sleeping under the same roof. And yet I can't let myself go, and the only reason I can muster is the fear that if I did, I might never again regain my balance. I visualise Mary as she'd been last week. I visualised Amy as she'd been last week, pale and worn out from a fortnight of coughing, slight as a fist of straw, having shed what little weight she'd previously been carrying. When those thoughts hurt too much, I reach for memories of how she was in her brighter days, beautiful that first or second year of marriage, before drink took a determined grip of Spillane and set about making ruins of them both. And how she'd been as a girl, during all the time we spent together after our mother had found steady work, when for long hours the world was nothing and no one else but us. Running and playing by day, and at night curled up together on our sacking mattress, tucked beneath our mother's old overcoat and listening to the mice in the ceiling, the two of us sharing secrets that could never be otherwise told. The images are there, but I keep them to a projection, like pictures spread across a screen, separate from me. I need to be able to put them aside and walk on from them. A certain distance deep into war, the realization dawns on a man that all there truly is, day after day, is keeping on, facing the fight when it's brought to you, but always forging ahead. Results, wins and losses are for the politicians. For the soldier on the battlefield, what counts is not dying. A week from now, this cottage is sure to be a different place. It's people that make a home. We'll miss my mother terribly, and she will ache just as much for us, each one of us in a different way, down to Nellie, our youngest, our baby. And we'll tell ourselves and one another, aloud and in our heads, that England is not the end of the earth, that Lancashire is just a short boat ride across to Dublin, and a few hours on the train back to Cork. She can be home in a day and a night, if needs be. We'll say that and try to believe it, but we'll also know, without having to hear it spoken of, that she's already old, and we could very well have seen one another for the last time. I'll stop there.
Fantastic stuff. I suppose one thing that a place to start would be, or something that really interested me, was the origins of the book. So obviously there's a wonderful storytelling involved, and I saw somewhere else you had said, I think that maybe the crux of all this was your grandmother, who would have known Nancy, I suppose knows everyone in the story, and that she had kind of informed the storyteller in you. And yeah, I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about that, and what was the ideas of the trauma that some of your ancestors had been through? Was she aware of that?
Yeah, Yeah, when I was a child, I lived with my grandmother. Nellie in the book, she died when I was about 7, and she was a great woman for telling stories. For most of the time that we were together, I was the only child in the house, so um, I got a lot of the stories. Uh, she'd keep me at home from school to tell me stories, which I was quite happy about because I hated school. So we sat a lot, and she would talk about her childhood, what it was like in Douglas growing up, the village where I live still, and she spoke a lot about her father, who she adored, and she knew the secrets of his heart, I think, um, and he had some secrets, uh, but she adored him. She thought he was the best man that ever set foot through the village, um, and so she spoke to him in kind of reverent terms. And one of the things that I remember her telling me was that when when he died as an old man, and he died with a smile on his face. He died in 1958. It would have been, and he died with a smile on his face. And it was only in later years when I started to look into the family tree, and really a lot of the credit for the family tree goes to my sister Irene and her friend Yen, who were great at researching and doing some digging. And we discovered a lot of things that were surprising to us, and yet I had known hints of them. I'm not sure even my grandmother knew the full extent of them, such as, for example, she knew that my great grandfather, her father, Ger, was that awful word that they used to use, illegitimate. Um, but I don't think she knew the full extent of, there was parts that he couldn't talk about or that were off limits. But research turned up some interesting facts, and one of them was that he had been born in the workhouse, which is only a couple of miles from where I live. And funnily enough, it's where my sister was born, because it's St. Finbarr's Hospital today, but it was the Union Workhouse back in, the I suppose the late part of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Then it became it became a hospital. But so, like, I carried a lot of stuff from that time, from things she told me. She talked a lot about his time in the war. He had been in the Boer War. He had joined the Munster Fusiliers, as as soon as he could, I suppose. And then after the Boer War, he came out of the army, got married, started his family. And then when the First World War broke out, he re-enlisted, and he fought in the Somme and Flanders, and he got wounded and came home. Uh, and it just struck me when I was writing the book. Initially, my plan was just to write that section, Jer's section. I was thinking of it in terms of a long short story, a kind of a novella, that probably nobody would want to publish, because it's very hard to do anything with a novella. But so yeah, I was writing the story with no intention of publication or anything. I felt I needed to write it. I'd always wanted to. And I was about halfway through that first section when I realized that I was going to have to write his mother's story, and then his daughter's story, to give the full scope of the life. Because a life isn't just a singular thing. It's, you know, it spreads itself. So yeah, that was really the origin of it. It was the stories that my grandmother told me initially that kind of lit the flame in me. You know, I wanted to see what it was about Ger that made my grandmother revere him so much. What it was about him, and that's what I was really searching for when I was writing it. So it was a combination then of research, and the influence of those early stories, and then of course there has to be an element of reimagining, because you know we don't live in other people's heads. So yeah, that was the starting point.
And something you touch on there is the idea that one person's life can't necessarily just be told through, you can't tell Ger's story just through Ger. And I think really that struck me, the legacy of Nancy's experiences, excuse me, of the famine and its aftermath is something that lives quite strongly in her children, Ger and Mamie, and that idea of of trauma passing from, like you said, like, you know, it's in blood almost, that it's something that we don't know but we're inheriting. Could you talk a little bit about that, because it runs quite strongly? I think even in your reading there you kind of touch on it, this idea that like we inherit past traumas.
Yeah, you know, it's that William Faulkner quote, you know, the past is not dead, it's not even past. And it's true, you know, we're all a product of our environment, but we're also all a product of our past, of what came before us. That's what shapes us. And in some cases, probably in a lot of cases, it's also what shackles us, because you know, most people aren't born into privilege, and it's a struggle to do better. I think it's always the struggle to do better. But the main the thing that really struck me was just how much these people did to survive, and not just to ensure their own survival, but especially for their family, you know, for their family to continue. You know, one of the things about writing this book, and when I chose to write it in the first person, and then to have three different first person voices, you know, I was aware of the limitations of that, and the idea that, for example, Nancy, who had come from Cape Clear, Irish speaking, had made her way to Cork when everyone belonged to her was gone, had made her way up to Cork City. She couldn't read or write, you know, even into old age. I've seen she had a passport of sorts, some kind of a document that when she went to England, she needed some identification, and she had signed her name with a mark. You know, it just said her mark, and you know that really struck me, because you know, if somebody is telling their story, they're limited to their capacity to tell the story. And so I wanted it to be, even though it's three first person narratives, I wanted it to be more than just the you know, our vocabulary, what we're limited by. I wanted it to be a sort of a narrative of feeling, you know, kind of the voice of the heart almost, or of blood. And so I wanted a sense of things being passed down, you know, which is really the crux of what the book is. It's the survival of the generations, and you know what's passed down with it. And of course, one of the things that is passed down with it is the trauma of what went before. You know, we talked about this yesterday, but I mean, the famine left a mark on our country that can never be erased. It's it's so ingrained, and a lot of what came after, was probably a consequence of the famine. I'm not sure that's ever really explored to its fullest extent, but politically, but socially as well. And I mean, when you think of the numbers of people that died and that immigrated, and just how devastating that was to a nation, you can't just shake that off. Especially if you came out of it, if you were one of the survivors of it, that's not something you can shake off easily, I think. And then as well, if you're starting at the bottom, it's very hard to come up, to climb the ladder, and it takes generations, I think, because it's not only the trauma is passed on, but I suppose the poverty is passed on, to an extent. It's so difficult to climb out of that. So yeah, that's I don't know if that's an answer, but that's
No, for
some kind of
sure.
an answer.
I think as well, it's probably worth maybe kind of turning to another aspect of the book, because while it deals with some like pretty difficult lives and experiences that, particularly I think in Nancy's case, what she goes, Nancy being the woman who survives the famine, her experiences when she like has nothing. But what I thought was really, really, I suppose, to explain to people, just a bit of context, is that her life is extremely difficult and she really struggles to raise her kids. But I thought what comes across in all of them is there's an undercurrent of a positive undercurrent to all this, in that all these people are survivors that the world has thrown at, like generations of your family in the book. There's some of the most difficult things you could imagine, but at the end of the day, and again, this is something we touched on when we were chatting about it, the idea that these people persevered, and there is is hopefulness the word you draw from it. But I thought it was something that really maybe makes the stories relatable to it, because I think we all face adversity, and at times life can really seem overwhelming, and then you read those, and but then, as you say, with each generation there's a progression.
Yeah, I think there's I think if people read the book, and it's a hard read, it's undeniably sad. But at the same time, I think if you read it and you only see the darkness of their situation, then you maybe haven't gone into the story enough, because that is the point. I think it's the strength to endure. I mean, what choice had they? Only to endure. It was that or die. So it probably wasn't a choice that they made, but it was it's the remarkable thing, I think, when and the funny thing is that this kind of a book, the characters in this book, the lives that are portrayed in the book, this is in almost everyone's background if you're Irish. Other countries have their other stories, but I mean, this is, if people only looked, this is likely what they'll find. This is the background for a lot of people, to some extent or another, because it wasn't my intent to try to write a history of Ireland in any way. All I was trying to do was write the story of these three characters, but because of the time period that they lived through, this is the context, I suppose. The social issues with the church, with society, with politics, the the fact of the famine, the fact of war, the fact of poverty, this was a hard time. And I think it's, like for Nancy, especially in the book, when I started writing Nancy's story, I wanted it to be as truthful as I could make it. Not just factual, but truthful, if you know what I mean. I wanted to really give a life of somebody in this situation. And like the thing that astonished me about her, the more I delved into her, was that she went through the worst possible experiences, and yet everything she was really selfless to the last. Maybe when she was young, maybe she wasn't, but once she had children, she was absolutely selfless. Everything was for somebody else. It was for her children, and I mean, they give medals to soldiers in wars. They don't give medals to people that live these kind of lives. But to me, they're just as heroic. They're maybe more so in a sense, because the likes of me wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them. And that's really one of the things that just resonates with me still now, even though the book is written a year ago or more. It's still that idea that all of these people that came before me, I'm a result of them. And that's a staggering thing to think about, because if one of those people had died in a field, before they had children, that would be it. I wouldn't be sitting here now. So that's the legacy, I suppose, of it. It's and that continues to amaze me.
Maybe just before we kind of the Q&A will be coming up soon enough, but I do have a question or two, just maybe about the structure of the book, because I think I don't know whether the book have worked or would it have been as powerful without the structure, the way it's written in 3 parts from 3 people, but then there's a continuity in terms of the voice that you're kind of hearing. It's hard to know whose voice. Well, it's obviously from each person, but it's not a. Could you talk a little bit about it rather than me trying to? Yeah, could you explain a bit about that structure, because it really is overwhelming in ways when you're reading it.
Yeah, like I mean, when I started writing the book, as I said, I my intention initially was to write Ger's story. I had written a long short story a few years ago, and it was the closing story of my last short story collection, which was The Boatman. Was the name of the collection, but the story was called A Death in the Family. And it was a story my grandmother had told me when I was very, very young, about her brother, Jimmy, who had died at 12 years of age in a tragic accident. He'd been picking ivy off the graveyard wall to feed to his pet goat. And he was standing on the goat's back and he fell and broke his back. And over a period of 6 months or so, he kind of curled up into a ball, and there was nothing could be done for him, and he died. He died young, and it was a story that, well, I mean, it probably wasn't a suitable story to tell a 5 or 6 year old, but these were the kind of stories my grandmother used to tell me, and she would speak to me as if I was an adult. There was nothing, I was shielded from nothing, and that was a story I tried to write for years and years, and I could never quite get it right. And then about, I suppose, maybe 5 years ago, I finally managed to get the story right. And I managed it because I had written it in Nellie's voice, in a first person narrative. And that was the key, really. Once I had done that, the next part, which is really this book, I suppose, Dwyer's story, I realised that if I was going to try to write it, I would have to write it from his perspective. And so that was the key, really, to writing this book, that short story. So what I did was I broke it into 3 sections. So you have 3 different narratives. But within each one, there's the past is almost as present as the present in the story. So there's a bit of jumping back and forth. Dwyer's part is set in 1920, but he thinks back about the war, and he thinks back about his childhood, and that's all folded into the narrative. Nancy's story is a bit more linear in the sense that, okay, she's writing it from somebody looking back on her life. In 1911, she's looking back over the bigger picture. Now, she doesn't die for another number of years, but she's elderly by this time. Well, she would have been maybe 60, which from the life she'd had was old enough. And so when I started writing that, I wanted to do something different than I had with the first part. So I wrote it in more of a linear way. And so we start from when she's born through to, it brings us up to 1911. Then Nellie's part, again, we get this kind of past and present jumbled narrative, because Nellie is dying just as I remember her dying in the house, and this was 1982, but she's thinking back to not so much her childhood, but the early days of her marriage, and so that was, I wanted the past, or these characters' pasts, to be as present in the story as they're present, if that makes sense. And it was there was a fair bit of trial and error in getting that right, but I got it to the point where it is in the book, so it was time to stop.
I could stay here asking a million and one questions, but I think there's some questions coming in from people. So if we have the first question, maybe?
Yeah, we do. So we have a question here from Brian in Dublin, and he's asking Billy, who are your greatest influencers as a writer?
I don't know if you heard that, Billy. It's Brian in Dublin asking.
I didn't hear it.
Brian in Dublin was asking, who are your greatest influences as a writer?
My great influences?
Yeah.
That's always a hard question to answer, because it's like trying to pick ingredients out of soup. Everything is piled into the pot. I suppose in terms of the kind of stuff that I suppose you're drawn to the stuff that kind of lights your fire, and they're the ones that hold on to you. So it would have been, when I was young, it was writers like Hemingway, Steinbeck, Ray Bradbury, people like that. Then once I reached my kind of maybe late teens, I started reading people like John McGahern, William Trevor, people like that, John B. Keane, for the Irish writers. Maybe the biggest influence on me, style-wise, were those writers that really, you could really see the work that they put in on their sentences. That to me was a wonder when I saw that. And it was people like John Banville, John Updike, these kind of writers that would write a beautiful sentence and would take your breath away with the sentence. And so those are the kind of ones. Because I suppose to a large extent I still think of myself as a short story writer, and I love the short story. And there's thousands of the great short story writers. People like McGahern and William Trevor, people like Alice Munro. I loved writers that wrote. I loved writing in translation. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Yasunari Kawabata, the Japanese writer. These kind of writers, but I mean, there's more than I could count. These are just some of the writers that I return to again and again. Yeah.
And do we have another question?
Yeah, we do indeed. So I have a question here from Anne O'Brien. She said, did the fact that the characters in the story are your relatives and that you had an emotional investment in writing it have a particular influence on the final outcome and on how the story was told?
So we have a question from Anne O'Brien, who is asking, I think, the connection between you, your personal connection between the characters in the book, the fact that you're related to them, did that have an influence on the outcome of the book, do you think?
I suppose it had to. I whether a character is fictional or whether it's, a character that's to a large extent truthful, or factual, I still try to approach them in the same way. I still try to make them as real as possible. There's limitations when you're dealing with real people because you have the shadow of their lives over you, I can see my grandmother now the way she was, exactly the way she was. And I suppose there's a certain limitation to that. But I think it helped the fact that I was a child looking at her. So she was somebody that was, larger than life in some respects. And the people that had gone before her were just stories to me. One of the things that I really tried to do in the book when I was working on the characters was just to be aware of the fact that people aren't one thing. We really do contain multitudes, and some of the stuff we mightn't want to admit to, and some of the stuff we're proud of, but it's all part of us, and it's all part of our makeup. And I think you have to address both if you want the work to be honest. This book was very much a labour of love for me. It was written with absolute respect for the people that went before me. But at the same time, while I was writing it, at no point did I think that it was going to be published. I generally don't think that when I'm writing a book anyway, but with this one, it was, I needed it to be as personal as it was while I was writing it. And I didn't want to have to compromise what I needed it to be. It's a hard one to answer because now that it's written, to me, their characters the same as the other characters that I've written in other books. And yet, while I was writing it, I absolutely lived their lives with them. And it just gave me a greater, one of the things that it really did as well for me was it gave me a greater understanding of myself. It made me, think about things a little bit maybe more deeply than I would have, in the past, that I might have just dismissed. Just having an awareness of other people. I suppose it's how you empathize with with the characters, and the fact that, you know, my grandmother, who, you know, I really did adore when I was a child, you know, writing her story, and, you know, I mean, some of it had to be, as I said earlier, reimagined, because, you know, not everything was told to me, but it made her, it kind of brought her back to life again for me. Yeah, I don't know. That's about as much as I can say on it.
And do we have another question?
Yeah, we have the final question here. So Lisa McInerney has said, like Billy, I lived with my grandmother as a child and she was great for stories too. Does Billy think historical fiction can be a way of tackling the loss of that oral tradition?
The Lisa McInerney was had a question that she lived with her grandmother as well, and I think had a similar experience of hearing stories. And do you think that historical fiction can be a way of addressing the balance that oral tradition of passing down stories, I suppose, is starting to die off, that we don't have it as much?
Yeah, you know, I hope that never fades. You know, that's one of the best things we have, I think, as a people, Irish people, this sort of oral tradition. That's dying out. No, there's no doubt about it. But, you know, as long as writers write the stories that were told to them, there's value in them, because, you know, they're remarkable lives. They're small lives, and yet they're remarkable, you know, for the things that they had to overcome. You know, maybe in 100 years' time, people will be writing about our generation. You know, we've had to overcome things, but, you know, could we really say we've had to overcome as much as, you know, have we had to overcome a famine or wars or, you know, political upheaval to the extent of you know, of those people? I'm not sure we have, but you know, there's something worth telling about everyone. You know, like short story writers definitely understand this, because, you know, the short story kind of really burrows into a moment in a life, and sometimes it's really only one thing in a life that's worth holding on to, or that's worth telling, but it's still a remarkable thing. I would hope that that oral tradition never dies out. You know, I think it's probably incumbent on people to pass down memories, because when they're gone, they're gone. If otherwise, you know, I remember I loved to read when I was young. I loved to read the American writer Ray Bradbury, and I remember he had a story. It was actually a piece in one of his books, and it was about these children that would gather around an old man. And this was in the 1930s in America. And the old man would tell them about the Civil War from the 1860s. And he was their time machine, was how Ray Bradbury put it, you know. And that really is what, you know, that's, you know, maybe we should view old people in those terms, because we can try to imagine what it was like, but it's not the same as having lived through it. So as much can be passed down, you know, the more that can be passed down, the better for us all, I think, you know, because, you know, like it's knowing the past allows you to know who you are, I think. So.
Billy, thanks very much. And just to conclude the event, I just want to first of all thank everyone who's tuned into this. Thank Billy for his time. It was absolutely great. It was absolutely fascinating to hear your insights in the book. And thank everyone who's put on court this year. It's a really I think it's a challenge and a testimony to everyone to organise it in the face of all the restrictions, but it's great that it's gone ahead. You can get a copy of Life Sentences at Charlie Byrne's bookshop at charliebyrne.ie. So if you go there, you'll be able to get Life Sentences. And if you want to find out, there's lots of events on as part of Court, and you can find out more at court.ie. And then finally, if you're enjoying the festival, events like this are not free to put on. Court is a charity, and if you can support at court.ie /support-us. So yeah, if you can, it would be great to support the festival. At that, we're going to leave it, and again, just one more time to thank Billy for his time.
Thanks, Finn. Thanks to everyone for organising this. It's great. I enjoyed it.